Okay. So I'm beginning.
People all over the world certainly have heard of Ted Turner, especially fans of this network. I spoke to my former boss today about his life and his accomplishments and about the new book that is just coming out about him called Last Stand, Ted Turner's Quest to Save a Troubled Planet.
I dedicate the news channel for America, the cable news network.
On June 1st, 1980, Ted Turner sealed his place in history as the inventor of 24-hour TV news. It's the stuff of legend. Ted Turner, the man who hired me here at CNN 23 years ago, is in the Situation Room right now. Ted, always great to see you. Thanks very much for coming in.
It's my pleasure to be here.
What's the single most important thing that people will learn about you if they read Last Stand?
Things that they didn't know before.
Turner is opening up about his relationship with his father, who committed suicide when Ted was 24 years old. You had a tough father.
I did.
You think about him a lot still?
A lot. I loved him very much. He was my best friend.
After his father died, Turner turned his family's struggling billboard business into an empire. Over the years, he's had his hand in TV, sports, sailing, and the restaurant business. He's also passionate about his causes, including the environment. He's one of America's biggest private landowners. He has about 2 million acres across 13 states. It's a big part of his life and the new book about him. You're really determined to save this planet, aren't you?
I'd like to. It's the best planet we've got.
And the single most important thing all of us can do, especially if we read this book, would be?
Is take care of everything.
Are we doing that?
No.
Turner has said his biggest goal is to change the world. He's close to fulfilling his long-term pledge to give $1 billion to help the United Nations. And he's a champion of nuclear disarmament. You fear nuclear war. All of us do.
Yeah, you bet. It'd just be the end of the world. Though I'm very much in favor of us getting rid of nuclear weapons as quickly as we can.
Turner's politics clearly lean left. He talks about his admiration for former President Jimmy Carter and his hopes for the current commander-in-chief.
Well, I think he's got an opportunity to really get us out of trouble.
If he's watching you right now, give him some advice. What would you? You're Ted Turner speaking to President Obama.
Let's be sure to get this global climate change under control.
When it comes to politics, Turner's son Teddy has different views. Teddy recently lost his bid for the Republican nomination in a special House election in South Carolina. Let's talk about your son Teddy for a moment. He was running for Congress.
That's right.
As a conservative Republican.
That's okay.
How did you feel about that?
Not bad at all.
Did you help him? Did you want to help him?
I did help him.
Did you give him some money to run and all that?
I did.
Ted Turner isn't as rich as he used to be. His fortune is estimated at $2 billion. He reportedly was worth more than $10 billion in 2000 after the sale of Turner Broadcasting to Time Warner. Since then, Turner has been sidelined. It's been a long time since he ran CNN, but he still watches it. And so you see what's going on, and so you miss it, right?
Yeah, I admit it. Sure, I miss it.
What do you miss the most about it?
The action. There's lots of action.
You got involved in all sorts of decisions, whether the first Gulf War, you were there at the end of the Soviet Union. You remember those days very vividly.
Absolutely.
Any one story stand out in your mind the most, looking back, that really changed you, changed CNN, may have changed the world?
Well, us staying in Baghdad to cover the war from behind the lines had never been done before.
On behalf of all of us not only here at CNN, but all of us who love news, all of us here in the United States and around the world, Ted, thanks so much for what you have done and what you will continue to do.
Thank you, Wolf.
What a contribution.
Right. I never knew much about him. And so I'm really learning watching these clips.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew he was married to Jane Fonda.
Yeah. Well, we won't go there completely.
Well, it's interesting because she's quite an activist herself, so they had that in common.
as we do this series, like you, I didn't realize that this was really a significant happening. Not only the concern for Mother Earth, but also he's kind of known as the inventor of the 24-hour news.
Right. And that changed everything.
Ever since the time that you and I grew up with the 6 o'clock news, Huntley, Brinkley, and they could only get in about maybe 22 minutes of news with all the commercials. Of course, there was only one commercial back then, but what a difference. Now people can be able to be aware of the news and just get, I think the word is innovated with.
Inundated.
That's
Yeah,
a-
it's kind of what we were talking about before. Now people get overwhelmed by the news because it's on 24/7, and a lot of people kind of get addicted to watching it all the time. And we're hearing about things that in the past we wouldn't have ever known about. Wars in places that we wouldn't have known were at war, and people starving and famines and outbreaks of Ebola and that kind of stuff that we just kind of went on our merry way and knew about the news in our general area. And so it does become overwhelming because you've got this constant barrage of mostly bad news, and you feel kind of helpless that you can't really do much about it. And so I don't know. It leads to a lot of depression, I think.
That's what we have grown up now with. And those who we are doing this recording for, they weren't aware of how limited our resources were to find out what's happening in the world.
Yeah. Back in that day, and that was in the 40s, you had to wait for 2 weeks for a letter. And you sent letter that, like, gee, Grandpa Joe is dying. By the time the person got the letter, Grandpa Joe had been dead for a week. And so the pace was so much slower. Now it's an instant email or an instant text, and that can be overwhelming too.
I have to wonder, because we grew up with the soap operas.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Our young people weren't really locked into a lot of those things. We do have a kind of a series of things that are now being produced, or something of, you almost grow up with a particular kind of experience with Netflix and things like that. But moving from just the limited resources and then to be overwhelmed, what has happened is that people are beginning to select a particular source
Yeah.
for their news.
Yeah.
And that gives the impression that it's something that can be so much a part of their consciousness that is played over and over and over because of the strategy of the various networks these days.
And it also, when you said they have one source, when I was growing up, people tended to choose NBC or CBS and, Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite, and who they really trusted, because they're on at the same time and you can't tape anything back then. You have to watch it in real time. Anyway, you pick that, but you trusted that news, and the goal was to give you news, just facts of what had happened, not opinions, and not, it wasn't supposed to be slanted. Whereas now it's really hard to decide whether something you see on the news is true. And certain stations tend to be left and other stations tend to be right. Not right or wrong, but on the right. And or if you're on Facebook or any of that stuff, trying to do fact checking and decide if something is real or not. And now with AI, we don't even know if pictures or any of that is true.
Well, we kind of saw, in some ways, a connection with those who brought the news as they became kind of the grandparents
Yeah.
in our life. Whereas I think, because now I have watched for the 30 or 40 years, how many people are really looking for that advisor, that person that you can talk with. Like in the old days, the Native Americans had someone that they could always go and talk and be free to express anything. They always had a grandfather or grandmother that they could just share life with.
Yeah.
I'm seeing that kind of need once again if if the opening happens.
Well, and still, when you talk about how things have expanded and how overwhelming they are, like you just said, in the past, you watched Walter Cronkite or you watched, Huntley and Brinkley or whatever. And maybe they had someone on that they interviewed, but it was, mainly them. Now, when you watch the news, it's a whole panel of people, and they're all expressing their opinions and what has happened. And that's kind of overwhelming too.
Well, since we're kind of on a newsy thing, I would like to at least speak of something that I have kind of come to know, but can't really, expound upon that. Is that we have made a study together, you and I, of a particular drawing known as the Peace Shield drawing of the Anishinaabe, and how that what came to this land was a very strong reach for a mental look at life.
Yeah.
So lots and lots of let's find out the details. And yet, in our study, is being able to balance not only the mental side of people's lives, but their emotional side. And a lot of the news was more factual that we grew up with. However, as I see, this is a short summary, we're moving to what we would call the balancer of news broadcasts are now real life stories that we watch and enjoy. And we've seen that one that you just mentioned is that there's a shift to how to feel how other people have felt. And then also being careful and respectful here. Certain news broadcasts are very active, generating more of an emotional response than a factual response.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's something that, however, it comes into balance, and that's where we're hoping that there's going to be a reason to see that the information and feelings need to come into relationship somehow.
And I would add to that kind of a caution because I see with that, stressing feelings more. The feeling that is usually stressed is fear.
Yeah.
A lot of this is to generate fear. Yeah.
Well, then there's the actions of what you do with that uncertainty and that fear is contributing to violence.
Right. Because it's hard for people. First of all, you get overwhelmed. Eventually, that volcano has to burn that energy. And if you don't have another way for that energy to go, it often goes to violence. I get that. I understand it. I don't condone violence, and I sure would like everybody to find another way, but I sure understand it. When you've been, what's the word I want? Especially when you've lived in poverty or violence all of your life. You don't really know other ways to deal with things.
In this moment, let's take one more theme that took place the next year of 1981. Talk about violence and how people on their own act out in certain ways. And so in our experience, was the attempted assassination of President Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And
that also brings up mental illness because that person was definitely mentally ill. which is a whole different category.
Hmm. And of course, the concern that has always been is what do you do when you have guns in your possession?
Oh boy, that's something that's, I mean, there were, people who lived out in the country had guns for hunting, but you didn't see nearly what you see now in everyday life in cities, everybody having all kinds of weapons, and the weapons have changed. It's not a rifle, it's not a shotgun or a BB gun, it's an AK-47. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah.
On this day 30 years ago, shots rang out in Washington and President Ronald Reagan was wounded by gunfire. The president was dangerously close to dying. It was a Cleveland man who slugged the gunman and brought the gunman down to the ground. Leon Bibb looks back 30 years.
When ABC's Frank Reynolds broke into afternoon programming with a special report, we knew there was trouble.
And shots were fired, apparently at President Reagan as he was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel this afternoon. The president was not hit.
The information was not complete. President Ronald Reagan was hit by gunshot. 3 others were also wounded. As President Reagan was driven away, gunman John Hinckley Jr. was wrestled to the ground. Press Secretary Jim Brady, a Secret Service agent, and a police officer were also shot. However, initially it was thought President Reagan had not been hit. But when blood was seen, the limousine sped to a hospital carrying a president with a bullet in his chest.
He was wounded. My God. The president was hit. He is in stable condition. All this information, the president was hit.
During the shooting, enter Cleveland connection Al Antonucci of Garfield Heights in the yellow sweater, standing in the gathering outside the Washington Hotel. When gunman John Hinckley Jr. fired, Antonucci helped wrestle the gunman to the ground.
Any man wearing a pair of pants that calls himself a man would have automatically done the same thing.
The day President Reagan was shot, 30 years ago today. The bullet missed President Reagan's heart by less than 1/4 of an inch. John Hinckley Jr., the gunman, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Today, 30 years later, Hinckley remains confined to a psychiatric facility. Local hero Al Antonucci later met President Reagan at the White House. Mr. Antonucci died in 1984. I'm Leon Bibb, News Channel 5.
And now, 3 decades later, federal gun laws have changed little. In that time, records show 2.8 million people have been shot in the United States. 1 million of them have died. Gun control advocates used today's anniversary to launch a renewed push for restrictions on guns. That included President Reagan's wounded press secretary, Jim Brady. He remains paralyzed, but he was anything but inactive on Capitol Hill and at the White House.
I used to be a track runner. No more. But I'm not going to run away from this. I know I would not be sitting here in this wheelchair if we had common sense legislation.
The public remains sharply divided over gun rights versus gun control. Many groups like the National Rifle Association say the Constitution forbids a ban on guns.
Well, here we are again. Let's pick up our conversation with 2 more events that was certainly difficult, at least for me, and a lot of people, because it had to do with our confidence that everything's going to be okie dokie with things. However, there's always, as we even have now, a concern for some issue of our health and how that the AIDS epidemic was a real surprise because it was so unknown as to what it was and how it's going to spread. And I believe the video that I'm going to show for that has to do with San Francisco.
Yeah.
And how that area was kind of a welcoming area for people with alternate lifestyle. And the AIDS epidemic really became an issue for the rest of the nation, now I think even for the world. So that's our next look into. What can you say about your experience with that?
Oh boy.
Yeah.
In a sense, you can almost compare it to COVID in that it was an unknown disease that we didn't have a defense for. And there were a lot of misconceptions about it, and it caused division, separation, and because people were scared. They didn't know how you contracted it at first. I had quite a few gay friends, and they lost so many friends. It was devastating because their friends were their family, because a lot of them had been kind of kicked out of their families. And so they formed new families, and to lose so many people was just, and that's also when the issues of gay marriage started coming up, because so many people whose partners were dying, they were not, one, allowed access in the hospital to be with their partner as they died.
Yeah.
And two, they often were, the partner's family would come in and take everything and kick them out of the house, and they weren't entitled to any inheritance or anything like that. And they just lost all their rights. So it made the loss even more devastating, because you felt like a non-person. So it was amazing. It did bring out more issues of gay rights. I remember the quilt. Do you remember the quilt?
Oh, yes.
Quilt that everybody, in fact, I did a square for the quilt, but people were sending in, there were hundreds of squares that were donated to this huge quilt, and it would travel around the country and be displayed. And I remember when it was in Washington, D.C. and spread out near the Vietnam Wall,
Yep.
And people would then just walk around it and go around, and most of the squares were people's names who had died of AIDS. And so as you went around this, it was a memorial to all the people who had died.
John Ferreira, Phil Harrington.
At sunrise this morning, they began their tribute to people who died of AIDS. The task of reading out their names, often more than their friends could cope with.
Jose Salz.
From all over the country, the families and friends of the victims had gathered to watch the unveiling of a huge quilt the size of a football field. Each panel bore the name of an AIDS victim. Often groups had made the panels, trying to catch something of the spirit of their lost friends in the design. When it was done and laid out in front of the Capitol building, the quilt was, as it were, lying at the feet of the American Congress. The government here is much criticized by the gay community for not doing enough to educate people about AIDS. Congressman Jerry Studs was among those taking part.
This administration absolutely refuses to engage in serious, widespread national public education. That, in my judgment, using words very deliberately, very calmly, is criminally negligent.
There were 2,600 names in all, each one a story of personal tragedy. Mike Trummer spread his dead lover's ashes on the panel bearing his name. Elsie Cohen lost her son to AIDS just a month ago.
He was just a wonderful son.
This afternoon, AIDS sufferers led a march past the White House, organizers estimating that 100,000 people took part. Ken Reese, ITN, Washington.
So the AIDS crisis brought up so much. And then, of course, looking for the cure. And Dr. Fauci was one of the only medical people who really stood by the gay population and pushed research, etc. And for a while, if you had AIDS, it was a death sentence. There was no treatment to help you. And then, of course, we've made so many strides, and people can live long lives with the AIDS virus. So, And they, caused a lot of political infighting and, and a lot of rumors, about where it came from. And there was a belief that the gay population was used as like guinea pigs, that the virus was purposely spread in that population because they didn't value that population.
The Christian community was already struggling in our lifetime of the 70s and 80s when half of the marriages were falling apart.
Yeah.
Okay, and that the children were having to deal with that kind of change. And then the 80s, as we're talking here, of how what was going to happen with people's attitude of those who were from a divorced family. And then now we have those who want to be able to have a life themselves and come out.
Yeah.
And so you have that that resolve that something is different than what we experienced 100 years ago as far as relationships are concerned. And then you add the AIDS, as if that gave people's judgment, attitudes. And I'm thinking, how in the world did the children struggle, how much struggle they had, because they were already working out different relationships with the divorce thing. And then all at once we have an issue of people who are experiencing and not finding community at all.
And, a lot of that is still going on with, I have two moms or two dads or, being accepted by their peers, etc. And the other thing I wanted to say about AIDS that I just remembered was Princess Diana.
Oh.
And Princess Diana went to hospitals and talked to AIDS patients, and she hugged these AIDS patients, which was like this huge issue for people because people still believed you could get AIDS from just hugging someone or shaking hands with them. And she did it out of compassion, but also as a statement to say, there's no danger here.
Well, that's the kind of thing that I wanted to have available for people to kind of vicariously step into the experiences of adult people and even the children.
Yeah.
And I have to wonder who helped them along the way with this.
School counselors.
How important it was for someone to be able to deal with those kind of changes that were not a part of life 100 years ago. Okay, so we'll give attention to that with the coming video.
Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, started as an exclusively gay disease. This depression of the immune system can lead to a rare form of cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, which shows up as those purplish spots. This cancer has a death rate of 80% 2 years after diagnosis. AIDS also causes unusual infections, with death rates of 100% in 2 years. This is not a benign disease, nor is it limited to gays, as we are now finding out. So far, 75% of cases are homosexuals, but 14% are heterosexual drug addicts. 5% are non-drug using heterosexuals with no other risk factors. 5% are Haitian refugees, and 1% are hemophiliacs who presumably caught it from blood transfusions. Females who are partners of male drug addicts can get the disease, and also infants of female drug addicts. What do we know so far? AIDS appears to be a virus transmitted through blood, semen, saliva, and other body secretions. There is a blood test for the disease. A study of the gay population in New York came up with some horrifying figures.
It has been done in New York, and they found that as many as 85% of otherwise healthy gay men showed evidence of imbalance in these tests of the immune system. We suspect from our experience here that we would find a similar finding.
Given the incubation period of 2 years, there could be a major epidemic in the near future.
Do you suspect that it's possible that this disease could be spreading from the gay population in San Francisco to non-gays in San Francisco and thence on to other cities?
I suspect it is spreading, and I suspect it will continue to spread to other areas of the country.
In walking around the hospital today and talking to doctors and nurses, one gets a feeling that there is some fear among health professionals here about contracting this disease themselves.
Special precautions are now beginning to be applied to hospital personnel handling AIDS patients. For instance, gloves are worn when drawing blood. Although San Francisco General does not require gowns and masks in handling AIDS patients, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta is now recommending that precaution to protect doctors and nurses.
There's a lot of anxiety. All of us that are taking care of the patients go through periods of personal anxiety about getting the disease. We don't know what we're dealing with, and we don't know how it's spread.
One major question raised is the safety of blood transfusions. The test for AIDS costs $160. Requiring it on all donors would make blood prohibitively expensive. Some have suggested not allowing gays to donate blood, but of course non-gays can have the disease also. What about the new hepatitis B vaccine? It's made from the blood of gay men. Its safety is now being questioned.
My understanding is that it's coming from gay men who have been victims of hepatitis B, which is the same community where the AIDS is most rampant now. Since we don't know just what the infectious particle is, I know there is some hesitancy now in the various departments, particularly among infectious disease here at the hospital, as to who should be receiving the vaccine.
Let's now change to the Challenger shuttle explosion. How did that come in your direction as a elementary school counselor?
Yeah, I had several schools, and I was at one of my schools that day, and it was in the morning. And my office was in a trailer, so they wanted to get me as far away as they could. But I came into the main building, and there was just a weird energy. And I thought, what is going on? And it was very quiet. It's not usually that quiet. And I came around a corner to where the library was and remembered that most of the kids were going to be in the library at that time to watch shuttle.
Yeah.
And so I went in, and everybody was just in a stupor. They were just staring at the screen, and the principal was standing there, and he came over to me and he said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "What do you mean? What happened?" And of course, they were replaying it over and over again, so I got to actually see it. And it was horrible. And a lot of the kids didn't really understand what happened, or they thought maybe it was supposed to do that, or, and other kids were much more aware of, this isn't right, this wasn't supposed to happen. And the public had become so involved in these things and in the rockets and so forth. And, a large numbers of people would go actually there to Cape Kennedy Canaveral, whatever, and watch the takeoff and so forth. And they interrupted television and showed it live on TV. And so it had become integrated into our lives. And we weren't expecting it. I mean, I think people always thought everything's
going to be okay.
Every attempt would be successful because this is America, and and we have the best space program and all of that. And then there were two, I believe, volunteer citizens who were on that flight, but one of them became very famous. She was a teacher named Krista McCauley. And she was planning all these lessons in space that she was going to send back. And they were doing videos for classrooms. And she was so excited about it. And she had a family, a husband and several children herself, but we really didn't think it was dangerous.
By this time, the astronauts or those that participated and prepared themselves to be an astronaut, they were already heroes ahead of time.
Right. And they've gone up and down, and I mean, they've been out in space. And of course, we had the moon landings and all that much earlier. But yeah, so it was, I mean, I know the people who were watching on the Cape it was just dead silence. Yeah. No one said anything. And that's how it was at my school, just dead silence.
There were, as there had been on this and past shuttle missions, delays this morning. This time it was Florida's freezing snap. There were icicles on the launch gantry, and there was a 2-hour delay until NASA officials were satisfied there was no danger. The family of Christa McAuliffe, the first teacher, the first private citizen to be chosen for a space flight, watched the launch.
And liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange.
For a whole minute, the launch went as planned.
Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
Mission Control gave the command for the last burst of power to kick Challenger into space.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up. One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles, downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
All that was left were the contrails of the bits and pieces of Challenger.
Obviously a major malfunction.
For 45 minutes, rescue craft couldn't get near the debris because pieces of Challenger were still falling from the sky. On the ground, shock. McAuliffe's parents, Edward and Grace Corrigan. It quickly became clear that no one had survived.
I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
NASA rejected suggestions that the mission had been rushed to avoid the embarrassment of further delays.
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintain that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go. And I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
Over the years, we've learned to take venturing into space almost for granted. The very choice of Christa McAuliffe symbolized that. She was the first ordinary folks to be chosen to go into space. If she could go, why not the rest of us? Today we found out that it isn't that easy. Today we learned the real cost of trying to conquer space. Joe Schlesinger, CBC News, Cape Canaveral, Florida.
And then it was, okay, I am one person with almost 500 children. How do I? And I remember going to each classroom and talking, letting them talk about what they saw and how they felt. Teachers were a mess themselves, crying and emotional and didn't know how to help the kids. So a lot of it I don't even remember because I think I was so overwhelmed that I just kind of blotted it out of my mind. But that was my experience. And of course, you don't get over a trauma like that in one day or one session. And I do remember I had kids who came to see me because then they were worried about everybody dying. And they were worried about their parents dying, and even though they're not going up in rocket ships, but it just made the issue of death come much closer. Yeah.
See, that's the experience that we have experienced, and that is certainly how that things do happen. And the Vietnam War, see, was bringing a TV war.
Yeah.
See, and then you have the younger generation experiencing and actually knowing death took place right there in front of you. And how that, that is an issue that needed to be given attention to.
And it also made us a little bit numbed to death.
Oh.
We were seeing so much of it. And then, of course, around that time, a lot of the violent video games and so forth, and there were more and more violent TV shows and movies. And kids kind of forgot that it was real. And,
the technology was totally picking up to where the video games were not like the pinball games that we grew up with.
No.
It was so real.
It was Grand Theft Auto, It was, where you got points for killing people, it's just crazy.
And it just, technology began to get even more real over time. Man.
Well, that's the other thing, when the earlier video games, I mean, you knew you were looking at a video game. It was not nearly. Now it looks almost like film. It looks real. And so the more real it is, the more we become numb to reality.